Chapter 3. Willow Cradle. Uncle Ilya lay in the snow in front of their house, slick red blood covering his chest and staining the snow around him. Auntie Paulina knelt beside him. "Sit up, Ilya," she pleaded, tugging at his arm. Mama and Tato stood off to the side, looking pale and still. Both leaned heavily on Tato's staff. Yulia and Slavko ran to them. I approached my aunt and uncle and put my hand on Uncle Ilya's neck. No pulse. "He's dead, Auntie." I wrapped my arms around her and tried to get her to her feet. "The baby," she said. "Where is she?" My heart went cold from fear. "Slavko," I called. "Come and help Auntie while I check inside." Slavko ran over and propped up Auntie Paulina while I ran into the house. Dead silence. A mug of tea and a half-eaten slice of bread with cheese on the table. The willow cradle hung from its rope in front of their pich, the clay hearth, but it was perfectly still. I stepped underneath it and was almost afraid to feel its weight, but it was now or never. I put my hands on the bottom of it and pushed upward. It was heavy. Tonya was inside, but she was so quiet. I untied the rope and gently lowered the willow cradle to the ground, whispering a prayer under my breath. Finally, the cradle touched the ground and I knelt beside it. I flipped the blanket back. Tonya, her eyes closed, looking peaceful. No sign of blood. I put a hand on her neck and felt her strong, vibrant pulse. I gathered my cousin into my arms and ran outside. "My darling girl," cried Auntie Paulina. She gathered Tonya into her arms and kissed her all over. "Come, Paulina," said Mama. "We'll go to the house. Yulia, I need your help." Tato leaned heavily on his staff as he came over to where I stood with Slavko, beside Uncle Ilya's body. "We need to report this to the authorities," said Tato. "It was the authorities who did this," I said. "We passed Short minutes ago, coming from this direction with a pistol in his hand." "Report what?" said a man's voice from the road. He was obscured by a stand of trees. "Who's there?" called Tato. A balding shock worker appeared. His pistol was raised in our direction. "Please," said Tato. "We're not about to cause trouble. My brother has been killed. I was just saying we need to report it to Tupolev." "Comrade Short carried out the execution," said the shock worker. "Comrade Chorny resisted arrest." "What was he being arrested for?" asked Tato. "He's a kulak," said the shock worker. "The surviving Chornys are to vacate this property." "We need to give my brother a funeral," said Tato. "No," said the shock worker. "I forbid you to touch that body. A sleigh is scheduled for this evening to pick up and dispose of all the bodies." The man's cold words stunned me. My uncle, the priest, his wife? Who else? How many other people had been killed in today's assault? Just then, a second shock worker, taller and younger than the one with the gun, appeared from the street. His pistol was holstered, and he walked slowly as he flipped through a stack of papers similar to the inventory lists that Alice had been making. He looked up from what he was doing and said in a bored voice, "Can you show me where the barn is?" The lack of emotion in these men left me breathless. There was a dead body lying in front of them, yet all they were concerned about was taking his belongings. We were grieving. We were in shock. But for them, this was business as usual. "Neil, show them the barn," said Tato in a resigned voice. I took the men out back, then stood and watched as they harnessed Tochka to Auntie and Uncle's best sleigh. "This will be perfect for removing the household goods," said the balding man to the younger one. "I'll meet you out front when you're done here." The younger man got the hay wagon and was about to harness Silny to it when I said, Excuse me, but do you have the inventory of my aunt and uncle's property with you? I do, said the man. What do you ask? That horse is ours, I said. Our barn burned down, and so our animals have been sharing my aunt and uncle's barn until we've finished rebuilding ours. They only have one horse. The man sighed. I suggest you get your animals out of here then, he said. He held up the inventory. It's all marked down here, but it's easy to make a mistake. I brought Selny to our own pasture, then went back and got our cow, our ewe, and her lamb. As I went back and forth for each trip, I kept an eye on what they were doing with Auntie and Uncle's house. Both shock workers were going through it and loading cauldrons and pots into the sleigh, but silver spoons and small gold icons ended up in their pockets. The younger shock worker came out of the house holding a stack of bound papers in his fist. What's this? He asked me. Just some notes, I said. It was much more than that, but I hoped he wouldn't figure it out. Uncle Ilya and Auntie Paulina had been compiling our local variations of old folk songs. There were love songs, laments, and kulisankas, but also one jaunty tune that some people thought made fun of Stalin. Is this the only copy? He asked. It's my homework, I said. It's not important. Do you think I'm stupid? I know what this is, said the shock worker. We've been looking for it. He struck a match and lit the corner, then turned it carefully to make sure the whole thing burned. The other shock worker came out to watch. It's good to get rid of this backward Ukrainian garbage, he said. You should stick to Soviet songs. They're much better. Anger and grief surged inside me as the flames destroyed years of work. I wanted nothing more than to punch those self-satisfied shock workers. My hands clenched at the thought of it. But then I thought of my baby cousin. She had just lost her father and her home. Punching these shock workers wouldn't change that. In fact, it might make it worse. I took a deep breath and tried to think things through. Cousin Tonya would never really know her father. He would never hug her or rock her to sleep again. I wanted to help her, but I had to be practical. They weren't about to give back the house or the items they'd taken, or unburn the songs. Auntie Paulina could remember and rewrite some of the songs, but there were two key things we needed to get back. One was Auntie and Uncle's hidden grain. I had no idea where it was hidden, but I knew for a fact that they would have stored some in a secret place as insurance against exactly this sort of situation. Getting that off the property and onto ours would have to wait for the right moment. But the other item was something that Tonya needed, something that was made by Uncle Ilya. Comrades, I said, I know this isn't the easiest job for you. You're only following orders. The balding shock worker frowned. He pointed his gun at me. Go home if you know what's good for you. Please, I said. I'm not trying to make trouble. You have kids too, don't you? The man looked surprised at my question. I do, he said. He lowered the gun just a bit. And we're all crammed into the corner of one rat-infested room in Kharkiv. His response surprised me. I had been so focused on what was happening to us that I hadn't thought about what life was like for the shock workers. My cousin, the baby, she'll make a good Soviet citizen one day. He pointed the pistol to the ground. My daughter isn't much older than your cousin. There's a cradle on the rope that her father wove with willow branches, especially for his only daughter. It's not worth anything, but it's the only thing Tonya has from him. Could you spare it for my baby cousin? The younger shock worker stepped out of the house just at that moment. He carried a variety of homemade preserves in a box and set them in the sleigh. The older man caught his eye and raised his eyebrows. What do you think? He asked. The cradle? I don't care, said the younger one, shrugging. The balding shock worker rubbed his chin as he thought about it for a minute, then said, Go ahead and take it. Children are the future of our country. Thank you, comrade, I said, hurrying inside before he changed his mind. My throat filled with sorrow as I clutched the cradle to my chest and walked out the door. The two shock workers had the decency to look a bit contrite with their pockets bulging with stolen goods. The younger one held a folded lambskin blanket. Take this too, he said, tucking it into the cradle. For the baby. Thank you, I said. I hope Stalin's plan works. We all deserve food and shelter. I walked across the road to my own house, balancing the cradle in my arms. But my thoughts were still on the events of this terrible day. It wasn't enough for the shock workers to kill my uncle. They also burned the songs. Our way of life was being erased. We had to figure out a way to escape before we were erased too. Auntie wept when she saw the willow cradle that her dead husband had woven with such hope and love. Thank you, she said. Every time I touch this cradle, I'll think of my dear Ilya. Slavko clambered onto my shoulders and looped the rope through our rafters to suspend the cradle in front of our own pich, where Tanya would feel warm and secure. Once that task was finished, Auntie Paulina settled Tanya in, and we raised it up. Auntie Paulina rocked the cradle back and forth to calm herself as much as the baby. As I watched, I couldn't help but wonder how Auntie would ever get over the death of Uncle Ilya. She had lost her husband, her home, and her way of life, all in one day. Thank goodness her daughter was safe. Otherwise, that would have been the end of Auntie, too. I had been so focused on getting Tanya settled that it wasn't until she was sleeping that I looked around our house. The bowl of pisenka had been smashed into a sickening mess of shattered eggshells and glass. Mama made a dozen or more pisenka every year, but they were gifted to friends. The ones she'd kept were very special. The oldest had been made by her own grandmother as an engagement gift to her grandfather. My favorite was the swirly one she'd made for Tato when they were just kids. But now, they were all just a mess of colorful shards. I looked at the walls and realized that our icons were missing, and in the corner near the door, there was no longer our white embroidered cloth with candles and the crucifix. The altar cloth had been replaced by a Soviet flag. A framed portrait of Stalin stood in the place of honor. On either side of him was a miniature toy tractor. Who did that? I asked, pointing to where our prayer corner used to be. Alice and her father left this note about it, said Mama, holding up a sheet of paper. I think she was trying to do us a favor so we wouldn't get in trouble. I'm sure it wasn't them who crushed the pisinke. I should bring my project home from school, said Yulia. Comrade Holodnaya helped each of us make a much better atheist corner than that one. Yulia's comment seemed odd to me, to say the least, so I ignored it. What else did they take? I asked Mama. They took the half sack of grain from the kitchen, said Mama, slumping into a kitchen chair and holding her head in her hands. That was supposed to get us through the spring. About half the food from the house is missing, and they raided the storage shed as well. What about the secret cellar? I asked. She looked up. No. Thank goodness, I said. I need to get our hidden grain, said Auntie Paulina. Is it underneath your manure pile? Auntie Paulina shook her head. Ours is behind a false wall in the outhouse. Timing will be key to getting it out of there, said Mama. That night, no one complained when supper consisted of leftover kasha, pickled beets, and rye bread spread with salo, smoked pork fat. I had no place to put Manka and Silny, our cow and mare, so they had to stay in the unfinished barn for the night. It wasn't an ideal situation because there was no door and it was cold out. Tato and Slavko and I had to clear out the building materials for just the one night. The first chore on tomorrow's list was to finish the barn. It was too drafty in the barn for Fluffy and Bebe, so they both had to come into the house for the night. It was also essential that we get Auntie's grain from the outhouse as soon as possible, so Yulia stationed herself behind a tree where she had a good view of the property. She kept a lookout while I got the sacks out from behind the false outhouse wall, and then we carried them back to our property, hiding them above the rafters in the house for the time being. Since the cradle was directly across from the raised sleeping platform behind the peak, it made sense for Auntie to sleep up there, so she would be the one to comfort the baby if she woke in the night. That meant that Mama and Tato got the lower sleeping platforms, and us kids spread our bedding out on the floor, with Bebe and Fluffy settling down beside Slavko. It was a tight fit, but we managed. I just hoped no one had to get up and use the outhouse in the middle of the night because I didn't want to get stepped on. I had the strangest dream of tractors and horses at war with one another. I woke up with a jolt before dawn without finding out who won the war, though, because of sounds from across the road. I got up to investigate the noise, stepping carefully over Yulia, Slavko, Fluffy, and Bebe as I found my clothing and boots. I went across the road to Auntie and Uncle's house, hiding in the shadows to see what was going on. Uncle Ilya's body was gone. All that was left was a smear of blood on the snow. A military truck idled in front of the house, and the grinding of its engine was what had woken me. Thank goodness we had moved the grain last night, as there might not have been another opportunity. As I watched in the dimness of early morning, a young woman dressed in country clothing hopped out of the back of the truck. Someone who stayed inside the truck passed her down a pail and mop and other cleaning supplies. The truck pulled away, leaving the woman on her own. She pushed open the front door of Auntie and Uncle's house and carried in the cleaning supplies. I was curious, but I didn't want to scare her, so I decided to wait until later in the morning to investigate further. In the meantime, I went to the barn and let out Silny and Manka, then checked on our chickens. It was finally light enough to drop back over to Auntie and Uncle's house without scaring that woman half to death. I tapped on the door and waited. She stuck her head out and asked, "What do you want?" "I'm Neil," I said. "I live across the road. This was my aunt and uncle's house. I just stopped by to say hello." "I'm Miroslava," she said, opening the door fully and stepping outside. "I'm from a village a few kilometers from here." She brushed back a long tendril of hair that had escaped from her braid and continued. "My husband was deported to Siberia as a kulak, but instead of sending me with him or putting me on the kolkhots, the shock workers kept me as a cleaner." "Will you be living in this house?" I asked. "As a servant, yes," she said. "Comrade Chort will be moving in here. His wife and son will be arriving by the end of the week, and he wants this place fixed up by then." So the man who murdered my uncle now got his house? The thought turned my stomach. Stolen's plan counted on getting the envious to prey on the industrious. I looked at this Miroslava, with her work-roughened knuckles and tired eyes. She was a victim too. I couldn't imagine how horrible it would be for her to have Comrade Short as a boss. We would be having him as a neighbor. I wasn't looking forward to that either. "That's our house," I said, pointing across the road. "We're friendly, in case you ever need help." "Thank you," she said. Over the next 2 days, whenever I had a break from chores, I watched what was happening across the road. Household supplies arrived, and as each item was brought into the house, I wondered if it had been confiscated from people who had been kicked out of their houses. Comrade Short came by only once while Miroslava was preparing the house for his family. It was impossible to miss his presence, though, because he shouted so loudly at her that we could hear it in our own yard. At the end of the week, a wagon with more items stopped in front of Auntie and Uncle's house. A woman whose silky green dress glimmered from beneath a fur coat was helped down by the driver. a sturdy boy about my age hopped down on his own. He saw me watching, so he came over to introduce himself. "I'm Grisha," he said. "Comrade Short is my father." Even if I hadn't already known who his father was, I would have guessed it. Like his father, he was tall and muscular, and like his father, his face seemed to be set in a permanent sneer. His mother walked over to say hello as well, and I was struck by how different she was from her son and husband. Her face broke out into a friendly smile as she gripped one of my hands in both of hers. "Please call me Yelena," she said. Her hands had no calluses, and her face was pale. She'd obviously never worked on a farm. Comrade Short didn't spend much time at the house at all, and for that I was grateful, because when he was there, he shouted at the women and stomped about. He'd also sit outside at the front of the house with a cigarette in one hand and a bottle of vodka in the other and watch the people go by. Seeing as we were the ones who went by most often, it was like living under a magnifying glass.